Okay, I'm going to go ahead and call our meeting to order. This is a study session of the Sammamish City Council for March 5th, 2018. We have one topic on our agenda this evening, which is a discussion on intersection-based traffic concurrency and level of service options briefing. Ms. Deputy City Manager.
All right. Thank you to our mayor and our city council. It looks like we are missing our consultant now.
Oh.
I saw her in the back.
That's okay. If we can pause for just a minute.
Okay.
We take recess?
Well, how about this? I will go ahead and do my introduction to the topic while Steve is tracking down Kendra.
Perfect.
I apologize. We were doing some last-minute updates to the PowerPoint in the back. So tonight, City Council, we are back in front of you to talk about concurrency and level of service policy updates. We are looking for direction this evening on the concurrency policy and the associated schedule, which we will present in just a moment. You will note this meeting, the information from this meeting will be a precursor to tomorrow's meeting, where we are going to ask the council to adopt a resolution confirming the direction provided this evening. So with that, I will now turn it over to our staff and consulting team and ask them to go ahead and introduce themselves. Cheryl, Kendra, Steve?
Good evening, Mayor, Council, Deputy City Manager. To my left is Steve Lenichevsky. He's the Public Works Department Director. I'm Cheryl Paston, the Deputy Public Works Director. And to my right is Kendra Breland from Fair and Piers. You all know her pretty well. She will be actually doing most of the presentation. We do want to say, if you have questions that we're not addressing, please go ahead and interrupt us. I think it'll help answer your questions as we go along. So we just have a few slides, but again, go ahead and interrupt it when you have questions. So I'll hand that off to Kendra.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. So I'll just go on to, again, our agenda, and I think Jesse gave a pretty good idea, but just things we wanted to cover tonight, just, again, a look back at previous work and decisions. We do have a proposed schedule change that we'll be bringing up tonight, which is largely to address some of the discussion at the last couple of council meetings. We'll do a quick recap of transportation planning tools and talk about intersection level of service policy. And I know that's going to be probably the meat and potatoes of our presentation tonight. So with that, just a quick recap here. As you know, we've been working on this concurrency topic kind of since last summer. And the previous council, when we got to the end of the year, really did leave a legacy of some decisions. And I just wanted to kind of go over them because I think they are really critical to the topics that we're addressing tonight. First of all, to leverage innovative data sources. Previous council, of course, gave staff direction to purchase INREX data such that we can do a more proactive job of planning Sammamish's transportation system. So we think that was a very wise decision, and just want to remind you that is a piece of data now at staff's disposal. Previous council generally favored intersection-only concurrency policy. So again, looked at a lot of options from around the state, but recognized that at least for the near term, that was probably going to be the best bet for the city. Thirdly, recognized that the TMP is really going to be on the steering wheel for addressing walking, biking, and transit modes. So recognizing that the TMP process, which of course is going to extend far beyond tonight, is really going to be that process where we figure out, what are those project and connectivity needs for those modes. Definitely have heard a desire to really maintain the high impact fees that Sammamish enjoys today. So making sure as we're adopting policy that we're not doing anything that would inadvertently get in the way of continuing to charge high impact fees. And then last but not least, developing kind of AM peak hour model. We recognize that the previous practice of looking at the PM peak hour only really missed some real hot spots that the city experiences in the morning, particularly as it relates to school congestion.
Kendra,
Yes.
I was hoping to clarify or kind of put a finer point on that second bullet.
Okay.
I don't think the prior council really favored the intersection only. I think, but I don't know, just to be fair. I'll just say that I don't really favor the intersection only. I favor the time of travel and the speed, but I am willing to compromise for now to move forward with the intersection only. It's different than what that bullet really says, so at least that's my view.
I think that's a valid edit there. I think I was trying to shorten things very
Understood.
quickly, and I think that's a good point. Okay. So in terms of the timeline that was discussed with the previous council, generally at the end of last year, the focus was really focusing on finishing up the TMP, using that as a process to identify a prioritized project list by early this summer, and accompany that with an update of the city's traffic impact fee program by the end of 2018. In terms of level of service and concurrency, the discussion was really around just quickly moving forward on concurrency and getting a new policy in place by the spring. As you know, in the last couple of months, with a new council coming on board and some good, robust discussion, we've gotten direction to really focus specifically on concurrency and level of service. And I will say, when we talked about that timeline with the previous council, we'd kind of said, this is the timeline to create policy, recognizing a draft of the policy, recognizing that's going to need to go through some process, including city council and planning commission and public hearings, et cetera. So with that, here's kind of our proposed schedule update based on the discussions we've had with you all over the past couple of months. I'm not going to read everything on this, but I'm happy to answer questions and discuss items. The key elements here is that we're going to be shifting our focus to exclusively the concurrency program development between now through July. And so the focus is by July having a concurrency policy and level of service policy that you can adopt, and then moving with the TMP kind of starting in August. That TMP process, we're looking at the TMP process actually extending into 2019, and at the end of 2019, essentially having a TMP, an updated comp plan, impact fees, and updated code. And the detailed piece here in this schedule is really this is a huge amount of work, both for City Council and the Planning Commission. So really, here's the lay of the land for meetings as staff has outlined them over the next couple of months. I'm sorry to say you're going to see a lot more of me, but I think it's a pretty workable, it's an aggressive but workable schedule with a real focus on getting an adopted kind of code revisions by July of 2017 or of 2018, excuse me. We feel like that's probably the most aggressive pace that we can move with, and we know that this council's very interested in kind of getting this in the rearview mirror and continuing to move forward. So before I continue on topics, I guess I wanted to pause here and invite any questions. Or I can keep going.
If I could jump in before anybody wants to
Don't
ask
have any
questions.
lights. Well, I didn't. Apparently, he's trying to supersede you. Do you want to let Cheryl make her comment? Okay.
I just wanted to say that the schedule, the piece of the schedule that's in front of you now, we will, of course, amend the comprehensive plan and the relevant codes for concurrency and LOS. And then when we finish the transportation master plan, we'll have to come back again and do the cleanup, amend the comprehensive plan and do some remaining code cleanup. So just so you know that.
Deputy Mayor?
I hadn't thought of it before, but it just hit me that on July 17th, as if we can stick with this timeline, we would have the code revisions. Do they become effective with the state as soon as we file the revised comp plan, or is there a time period after that?
Those are our code revisions, so I believe is it 30 days? 5 days.
5, okay.
So
but-
those are
But the
ours.
comp plan amendment is immediate on filing with the state.
I believe
Okay,
so.
good.
I believe so.
July 10th, actually. Okay, very good, thank you.
Okay, well, I'll keep going. So just before we get into level of service policy, because it's a really important policy, and I know you all are looking to do the best you can, I just wanted to provide a very brief overview of some of the key transportation planning tools that are at the city's disposal. And when we talk about those transportation planning tools, and this slide I did show at the last council meeting, really, they fall into kind of 3 camps, from tools that are focused on capital project list development, to tools that are focused on optimizing your current transportation system and making sure that it's operating as well as possible, to those tools that are focused on development management. And some tools do just one of these things, and some tools do all of these things. And the table on the next page really kind of summarizes how all of these tools work. And I'm not going to go over all of them, but I did want to highlight a few that are very important. First of all, the Transportation Master Plan again. The Transportation Master Plan really sets the city's transportation vision. It develops that prioritized project list. It identifies kind of those high-level policy themes in your vision. So that TMP can come up with capital projects, it can come up with policies that influence the way that you operate your system and the way that you manage your development. Other tools that are really important, and I'm actually going to contrast them a little bit with concurrency here. Coordination with other jurisdictions, including your transit agencies, your neighboring cities, and WashDOT. As has been brought up a number of times at council meetings, sometimes the intersection and the biggest issues that affect Sammamish residents and their day-to-day travel aren't necessarily in the city or under the city's control. Those 202 intersections in particular, I think put a exclamation point on the importance of regional coordination. So remembering that staff, council members through ETP and different boards, we can all continue to advocate. You can advocate through staff time, through council member time, through your pocketbook or your checkbooks. So there's a lot of different ways that we can continue to coordinate and make really important regional capital investments happen.
Kendra, I've got a question up here. Deputy Mayor Hornish?
Actually, not so much a question, but a comment. And maybe I'll let you finish up with the slide, if I could. Are you finished with the slide, or?
Sure,
So, okay. I know we had some discussions, one-offs, about how concurrency is a small portion of the transportation planning that you kind of show here, right? It's one of, I don't know, a dozen items. And I was struggling with that, as you know. And I think I've got a better way of thinking about it at this point, in that maybe concurrency is not so much part of the transportation planning, and you kind of show it here on this chart. It's more about development management and development planning. And oh, by the way, it is the only threshold question for development. I just want to read what I've been studying a lot of this from MRSC, and it comes from the GMA, but they say transportation is the only area of concurrency that specifies denial of development if LOS standards cannot be met, which is why I was struggling so much with saying, well, concurrency is such a small part of transportation, but it's such a huge part as to whether or not development can or cannot occur. So it was just kind of an aha moment with this slide that helped me understand. It's more of a development tool than a transportation tool, if you will.
I think that's a very astute kind of observation. The things that it does and the things that it doesn't do, it looks at, of course, your concurrency facilities, whatever you've defined those to be. We have 43 concurrency intersections, and so essentially what it asks is, are they meeting the city's standard, yes or no? It doesn't actually prescribe what the solution would be.
Right.
And it certainly doesn't look at, concurrency doesn't include intersections outside of the city or facilities outside of the city. So I think, as you put it, it's a development management tool. In terms of, and actually Cheryl's reminding me, the 23 concurrency, so 23 intersections, correct? Existing, under current policy. And I start thinking about our future policy.
I thought it was 30? 7 are outside. Okay, got it.
So other tools, I just wanted to highlight just 3 more, or just a couple more here. One is data management, NREX, non-motorized and motorized data. Again, council gave staff the ability to go purchase that data, and that helps us to proactively manage our system. So we're not waiting for failures. We're not waiting for a model to tell us something. We're actually able to say, you know what, this is an issue. Let's go address it, and let's be proactive about it. The last one I wanted to talk about, other than concurrency, is really SEPA. And that SEPA is another really, really good tool out there. What SEPA does is it helps us to identify offsite offsite impacts that are occurring. And, you know, it's kind of, when you think about concurrency and SEPA, it's kind of like a Venn diagram. There's certainly some overlaps there in terms of the intersections and the impacts that they look at. But they do look at different things. So again, having these tools and being able to apply them and all of them in different ways really helps you to to really optimize the way you're planning your transportation system.
Okay, I've got some additional questions up here. Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, so just trying to understand what sort of, in looking at the whole transportation system, and if I understood it, and this, it is truly a question, is that I thought concurrency was really supposed to be a test that we can use to validate that our transportation system is still working as we had planned and expected, and to show us, or not show us, but even predict when something may start to be a problem, so that we can get ahead of the game in terms of being able to plan for a correction of that, so that as development comes online, we can continue to see a somewhat steady operation of that whole transportation system. So I guess I don't see it as a development management tool. I see it as a test that we use to confirm that our system is still operating as we expect it to, and to foreshadow or foretell when something may not, when something may start to underperform, and then we know as council that we have to start working on that. Is that correct, or am I thinking of
I think the way
incorrectly?
you're characterizing it as a test is a very good one. And when you talk about being forward-looking, the horizon for concurrency is not just what's going on today, but state law does provide a little wiggle room, and then it says that essentially it does let you take credit for those capital improvements that are funded over the next 6 years. But also, as the city's been looking at it, they've also been paying attention to, so what development has already been approved and is in the pipeline. So yes, there is that 6-year lookout, but concurrency is a yes-no test. Concurrency doesn't tell you what that fix is. So if you have an intersection that's failing, what it doesn't do is tell you, well, what do we do about that intersection? If it's a side street stop, do we build a signal there? Do we build a roundabout? Is the appropriate fix really not even at that intersection? Is it improving your roadway network and the connectivity so that people have different ways to travel? So that's the things that concurrency doesn't tell you. It essentially just gives you a test of whether it's pass-fail. It doesn't then give you a path necessarily forward.
Thank you.
Councilmember Valderrama.
Yeah, I would concur with that position, in the sense that if you wanted to call concurrency a development tool, then it would enter into another chart with stormwater, tree retention, dimensions of the homes, and all our other tools for every development that we have to put in. But it is a check that's being taken on the intersections based upon the level of services that the city has established upon itself and decided, and we can change and move up, and that's always been the case of cities in the past who have looked at it and said, well, we're not going to put that money in, so either we'll change the letter or just call it a failure and move on. Hence, the state averages D for concurrency. You had mentioned the point earlier on about SEPA, and it goes, and you had mentioned also the comment that the biggest problems that the city has have been outside our city. You had just mentioned that. The unique thing towards when you were talking about SEPA, as I understand it, is that SEPA is unique in that it does look broader and looks outside to Redmond and into also the Issaquah intersections that are normally not taken in. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind since you raised those two issues that I'd like to draw together. And third, it's a small point to Councilmember Hornish's, Deputy Mayor Hornish's point early on. The last workshop that we had with the past council was in, I guess it must have been December, on transportation. The council and the new council members were there, and while they could not vote, they were asked, and they all did support the same level of services of intersections, and recognizing that you're saying move on nonetheless, but just to say that they did have their input at that point. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Hornish.
Yeah, I was going to actually highlight, since you brought it up on the SEPA, doing some more studying on the code, and I haven't determined whether or not it's still part of the code, but if you want to make a note, or we can talk later, but if you look at chapter 14.25, it talks about intersection standards in our code. First thing it says, this chapter is enacted pursuant to the SEPA chapter. You get down to 14.25.030, it says a street intersection for a proposed development that will function at a level of service worse than E.
I'm sorry, we're what?
Worse than E, as defined in the Highway Capacity Manual. This, to me, says very clearly that the state has decided on a level of service of E. We have a different standard. So SEPA and concurrency is two very different tests. You can't substitute one for the other.
So nobody's saying it's a one-to-one, but it is broader and looking out at the intersection.
But it's a lesser LOS than what we've established for our local
I don't know.
streets.
Actually, that'd be a good question. Is that correct? That it's a lower LOS?
Well, I mean, I guess when you're applying SEPA, you're looking at the level of service that's been put in place by the relevant jurisdiction. So at the state, we look at the state's LOS. Here in Sammamish,
And
under
they
streets and
use an
roads-
E. They use an E
Yes.
according
No,
to
no.
this code.
But I think she's asking about our hearing examiner would apply our city standards?
The hearing examiner, as I understand it, and I'm not the hearing examiner, obviously, the hearing examiner would likely apply the standard in the relevant jurisdiction. So to the extent that WashDOT says it's E, and so at the WashDOT intersections, when you're looking at SEPA, you would use your threshold of determination at what the state has said. Whereas here in Sammamish, we would look at, well, what is the Sammamish level of service guidance for Sammamish level of service intersections?
That was my understanding.
I have Councilmember Moran.
Well, I wanted to, again, go back to what Councilmember Hornish was stating, that this is more of this would fall under development. I don't see this as a tool, but rather from our own state WAC, where it says that concurrency is to make sure that we have adequate facilities available when the impacts of a development occur. Concurrency ensures consistency in land use approval and development of adequate public facilities as plans are implemented. So that goes back to what you were saying, to make sure that it's more of a land use.
Councilmember Ritchie.
Just trying to make sure I understand this correctly. The word concurrency, more to what Councilmember Moran just said. Are we developing our road infrastructure and our commercial residential building developments concurrently?
I love that that's always my trick, is to remember concurrency and concurrent, to
Right.
use that. And the only thing is just, again, you mentioned only a certain type of land use, it's all land use.
All land use. So tool,
But-
not tool, planning, otherwise, in my mind, for whatever it's worth, the term concurrency, the measurement tool, the analysis, the purpose of it is to build a bridge, literally, between transportation planning and land use. Are we doing them at roughly the same time? And how do we as an individual municipality measure that? And it's up to us to do that. Is
I think that was very well stated, and the only thing that we always bring up to remind folks, that's a bit counterintuitive is the state provides that 6-year wiggle room.
Right. Okay, thank you.
So I'm just going to make a quick comment here too, as we're talking about concurrency and how we're defining it. I CC'd you all on an email late tonight, so I recognize you may not have had the opportunity to read it, but I sent it off to staff asking a bunch of questions. And my question was centered on Title 14A of our code. And in that code, it reads, if any road, street, or intersection operates below the level of service standard, development may not be approved anywhere within the city until the level of service is achieved, or transportation improvements or strategies to accommodate the impacts of development will be completed within 6 years. So that speaks to concurrency and 6 years. And staff responded that there's some question about what does 6 years mean as far as does it have to be completed? Does it have to be funded? And later on in my email, you'll see me talk about Issaquah Pine Lake Road and how we have not funded that road. And my personal sentiment is that we have failed on Issaquah Pine Lake Road specifically because we have not offered up any funding within a 6-year window. It has been sitting on our transportation improvement plan for 12 years and has not been fixed. And so I think that's part of what got us to this point here, that we're here right now. It's starting last summer. But I would encourage you at least to read the conversation that's going back and forth between my email and staff and response. But I think what it does highlight is some changes on a policy level that we as council need to consider taking on. Because when we say concurrently, you would assume that we are using the latest data to inform ourselves whether or not we are meeting a certain level of service. And we are not. In fact, we are looking at 2012 data as far as intersections go in 2017. We're not looking at anything in 2018 because we have a moratorium in place. But if it were pulled off, we'd be looking at 2012 data to inform ourselves as to whether or not our intersections are functioning until we adopt them. So my suggestion was, in code, we need a reference not to, in the comp plan, that we will use the most updated numbers so that we are literally being concurrent rather than using very old data to inform ourselves as to whether or not we are concurrent. So. And now everybody's lit up. I still have Karen lit up. Are you?
No, hold on mine.
Okay. Councilmember Valderrama.
I'm trying to, I guess there are two questions that are raised. in
Only
that,
two?
and- Yeah, off the tape that I have. The first one, just in principle, the city has a policy that we've been maintaining of growth pays for growth. Issaquah Pine Lake Road in particular, now, as I understand it, 60% plus is being paid by the developer that's coming in. So I don't know if it's a failure on our part or actually a success that we are requiring under what I understood you saying is we should be picking up and not passing that to the developers. I just want to make sure that's not what you're saying.
That's not what I'm saying. We have an
Because Issaquah
existing
Pine
level
Lake
of
Roads,
service
how would
failure.
we have been funding it if we want the developer to pick it up, which is Connor Jarvis now?
So they're only doing frontage improvements, and they're doing frontage improvements because of Table T8. So we're collecting impact fees to pay for what we're asking for, and we're asking for impact fees to pay for curb, gutter, sidewalk, and bike lanes. That's
Yeah.
not adding capacity to our roadways, and that's where I take contention with our plan for Sahali. While it was nice that it was funded at 80 or 85% of impact fees, we weren't buying ourselves any capacity on the roadway. We were buying what our concurrency policy said we got for our impact fees, which was curb, gutter, sidewalk, and bike lanes, not lane miles,
Now,
essentially.
I was in support of stopping Sahali for that reason, but on Pine Lake Road, they're working to the design that we're giving them and building towards the design.
We haven't even designed it yet. We just funded a design for 3 to 5
Yeah,
lanes.
but
All
gonna
they're
be
doing is
picking up
curb,
the
gutter, and
60-some
sidewalk.
% of that is, there's supposed to be funding on there. The second part goes, you were talking about the 2012 data, and as I understood, we ran the 2012 data, and then trying to keep apples to apples, oranges to orange, keeping Klahani out of the mix because Klahani was not there in 2012. We then ran the 2014 data, And
Not for intersections, though.
And well, that was my understanding, and that we ran
2012.
2014, and we ran 2016 under the old data, and that technically, those are not failing. Is that correct or not, under looking at 2012, 2014, 2016 data?
So the
Mics are turned up tonight.
the 2012 and 2014 combination, so we've tried to deduce what that exactly was. So staff here now, we're not involved with that update. So I can't confirm if it was segments and counts or intersections, but there is a combination of 12 and 14 data within the 2015 comp plan update.
Right, but the 2012 and 14 data is specific to trip counts, not the intersections, at least according to the labels on the tables.
Yeah.
It says 2012, and
Could
then
be.
the other one says 2012/2014, and it's delineated which numbers are 2014 numbers. The values for the table and level of service of intersection is all 2012.
Well, I thought, is that correct, or did we do 2014 and 2016 data? Because I understood that around January,
Did not adopt the 2016.
September. I know we didn't
No.
adopt it. I'm telling you that did they run the model, and did it technically show no failures?
The draft work last summer
That's
was
correct.
using 2016 data. We also proposed different intersections, which showed some failures. We did not rerun the existing system with 16 numbers.
But technically, with the same ones, apples to apples, would we have any more failures?
We did not run that.
Okay.
So what we were given last July, there were 8 failures inside the jurisdiction based on what we did not adopt at intersections.
Some of which were new intersections.
Yes.
But yeah, that's because of the new intersections that were added. And I think all of them were the new intersections, weren't they? That were, so, but in the old intersections, there were no new failures with those datas.
Under the previous.
That's correct.
And existingly adopted methodology, correct, which is
Okay.
PM.
Well, that's it. So the baseline data, if we were to compare to the old ways, 2012, 2014, 2016, we would then be with no failures under those same intersections, not including Klahani.
That might be a coincidence and it might be real. I see your point, but we did not rerun those specifically by themselves.
Okay.
Ms. Deputy City Manager, did you have a comment?
Thank you. I just want to go back to the point the mayor made about the project sitting on the 6-year TIP, and the Issaquah Pine Lake Road project, as was mentioned, sat and was continually bumped out. I can tell you, we don't have a good understanding of why those decisions were made, or the legality of those decisions. I will suggest we ask our attorney tomorrow. I also talked to the mayor today about a course correction on policy. If the council is not comfortable doing that, then all of the failures need to go onto the TIP. They were planned to do so anyway, I should correct myself, and we need to figure out how to fund them. So we had a sidebar as staff prior to this meeting, and our anticipation, provided we get direction on a policy and we can point to the specific failures, is by the time we hit June, which is when you'll be looking at your transportation improvement plan, that's your 6-year funding plan, we would have all of those failures and potential remedies identified. And we're not there yet today. We need policy direction. So that, but I do want to say, Councilmember Valderrama made a good point that sometimes a developer is going to come in and fund a part of that project. It's happened all over the city on numerous occasions. So we've maintained some flexibility, I think, partially for that reason. But I do take your point. The other thing I want to make sure we don't get lost in traffic counts versus traffic model. When we build a traffic model, we use a base year of traffic counts as the base for that model. So in the 2015 comp plan, we don't know why they did it, but there were 2 data sets mixed, 2012 and 2014. As development occurred, the impacts of that, and we use the filling the glass analogy, the impacts of those developments were added to the model. So the model is not, it was built off of base data, and the cumulative impacts of the development as it occurs is added to the model. So we call it a pipeline model or an iterative model or cumulative model. When we, in subsequent years, when we take traffic counts, what we're doing is verifying that the model is working. So the model is an engineering predictive tool. So we take our counts and we look at what the model's saying, and we verify our inputs are correct. If they are not, we have to go back into the model, sometimes into the field, as we did recently, and figured out what was happening that was different. Did I say that correctly?
Very good.
Anyway, that doesn't mean we shouldn't periodically update the model, because things change. Most cities update on a 6 to 10 year frequency. Ours has been closer to the 6 year historically. So I hope that clarifies counts in the model.
Councilmember Stewart.
All right, I'm going to play the new member card again, because that was a lot of information, so.
Getting kind of old.
Yeah.
Not yet. We all agreed, I think we get at least 6 months, so. Mayor, you said that we had a failure at Issaquah Pine Lake Road, but
There's a level of service intersection failure.
there's a level of service intersection failure according to the existing code and the existing data being run. There was a failure. Is that?
In this, you will see the intersection later in this slide deck.
So,
it
but
failing.
based on the 2012,
Yes, it was already failing.
2014. Okay, so I just want to understand. So there was an existing failure. Okay, that's
An
what
unadopted existing failure.
what does it unadopted
We
mean?
did not adopt the failures that were identified in June of 2017. There were 8 of them inside the jurisdiction. We did not adopt those in our transportation element of our comprehensive plan. And so because we didn't, the city continued to use 2012 data.
So that's what I'm asking. So the code, as is on the books right now, and the policy that staff is bound to follow, there is no failure. It's only
Right.
if we made a change, and the
Adopted.
council did not adopt a change. So I just wanted to understand that while I understand what you're saying, that if you look at new stuff, there is a failure, but the policy as it is showed no failure. So there was no lack of compliance of the policy.
Technically, yes. Had we gone ahead and not done any of this concurrency work, and we had
Right.
adopted the transportation element of the
Yeah.
comp plan, we would have 8 failures currently in the city without touching concurrency.
Well, that's
at all.
unfortunate that we didn't adopt that, huh?
Well, in part, but then that would have informed our TIP. Those projects
Right.
would have then been on our TIP.
Correct.
And then they would have, in theory,
But it was-
funding
right.
associated with them. But I point to the TIP that it has become a parking lot, in my opinion, for projects to sit and not be funded. And
But
that's
that's-
not the idea
Right.
behind the
But
TIP,
but
nor
that's up to,
concurrency.
and again, sorry, new member card, but that's up to the council to fund those projects, is that correct?
It's certainly our role, yes, but we got the numbers in reverse. We got the TIP first without getting to see the failures. So we adopted a TIP without seeing the numbers and knowing that there were failures.
But
Had
then
we-
you saw there were failures, but the council didn't adopt.
That's when we started going down this rabbit hole of, wait a second,
But
we're
I'm sorry,
giving
if
credit for.
Sorry, so you saw that there were going to be failures with there was a proposal to change the comprehensive plan, and that would have created failures, but that was never adopted.
We did not adopt it last
Okay,
July.
I just wanted to make sure that I followed all of that. And if I understood Kendra correctly, because you referenced table T8, but as I read through and tried to understand concurrency, and as Kendra mentioned, concurrency does not dictate solutions. So the fact that people have opted to add bike lanes and sidewalks to correct a failure was an option, but it was not dictated by concurrency policy. There could have been different options chosen, like capacity added to correct the concurrency failure. Right? Am I understanding that correctly? That was a choice?
Can you repeat that, please?
So there is no law or policy that says if there is a failure, if something were to fail concurrency, under the current policy, right? So nothing's been changed, that if there were to be a failure, there's nothing dictating that says you must add a sidewalk and bike lane, and that is how you would solve the failure. Again, council could choose how to correct that problem by funding additional capacity. That would be an option that the council could choose, correct?
I want to have staff answer it because no, we require frontage improvements. So we require that of developers. There was.
But that is not the only that is not the only option. What I'm saying is that you could require different things, correct?
Let's have Steve answer.
So there is a project list associated with your concurrency intersections or currently still segments and corridors, right? So the Connor Jarvis example, they are doing their frontage because it is a requirement of development. They are also putting in the project as it would be proposed in the, if you go to the current plan we have, it has an adopted project list which speaks specifically to Issaquah Pine Lake Road. It should have a 3-lane section, bike lane, sidewalk, widening, access control, signal at 42nd. So they are widening. They will be having turn pockets. They aren't doing them the whole way because they have to blend and just do their area, but they are adding turn pockets, they're adding a traffic signal, providing the curb gutter and sidewalk as required by the standard. And then they do get credit for those against their impact fees because they are doing a project in the system. So there is a prescription to some extent. It's not engineered. Like the mayor was referencing, we don't have the design done yet. We know pretty well what we think needs to be there for this section, but.
But I heard 3 lanes, I heard turn pockets, so it wasn't just bike lanes and sidewalks.
That's correct.
I think if I could just add to that, I mean, this is where we're coming up with the way the city previously did business, which Table T8 kind of guided how you created complete streets in this community. The city's never had a TMP before. And so really the only guidance that was out there was T8. And if you've got a capacity issue, T8 provided a menu of things that you would do. Now, Table T8 didn't actually answer whether this is the best place to provide a sidewalk or the best place to provide a bike facility. It didn't really speak to connectivity. It just was a pretty blunt tool to say, all right, this street is starting to carry more volume. Here's how we transition from a rural cross-section to our more urban one. Now that's where we have a really exciting opportunity here. We're about to start on the TMP. We don't have to follow that rule book. We can make our own rules here. We can create the project list that makes the most sense. So I don't know if that helps, but T8 kind of did guide the city's hand in the past. Previous council decided that's not where we're going, and I think, quite frankly, I think that a TMP process makes a lot more sense because we can be a little more thoughtful.
Kendra, can you talk, since we're focusing tonight on intersections, can you speak to what Councilmember Stewart just said about concurrency not being prescriptive and the range of solutions we might have from signal timing to full-on roundabouts?
Sure. I think about when we look at this table, I'll just pick out one out of a hat, and well, I don't know if I want to pick one, but so we've been talking about Issaquah Pine Lake Road tonight. So let's talk about Issaquah Pine Lake Road, and I think we've got 42nd, which of course right now actually has a span wire system with a signal today. So there's all kinds of things you could do to address the level of service issue there. So I think it's currently been, it's previously analyzed as a side street stop controlled intersection. It was failing. So when you've got an intersection that's failing, there's lots of things you can do. You can put a signal there. You can put a roundabout there. But other choices you have, and not looking at a map right now, the connectivity there specifically, well, what if we've got some roads that don't connect? Yeah. And we could suddenly provide another way out of that neighborhood. That might alleviate issues at that intersection. Putting on my future hat for a second, say we're looking, concurrency only looks 6 years out, but say there's a really great transit option. So and that might be stretching a bit, but the point that I think Jesse's asking me to make here is that concurrency tells you if there's a pass or a fail. Now, what the range of solutions are, that is something that as a part of a TMP process, we're going to be looking at.
Councilmember Valderrama.
Yeah, just following on that point is, first of all, you have the option also of letting it fail or changing the standards and saying, hey, this fails. And frankly, that's East Lake Sammamish Parkway. East Lake Sammamish Parkway, when we were first looking at that project of putting down a ton of money, and I'm talking about in excess of $100 million by the time that thing would have been done, I think we spent 18, we calculated with Jaron, just going from Inglewood Hill Road, that median up to 20th Street. Redmond, WSDOT, and DOT in King County all said no matter how much you spend, you're not going to get more cars off of East Lake Sammamish Parkway. It's got a choke point in the north with that flyover that's timed for it. And in fact, they told us back then, this was 10 years ago, that if we were going to build a community center, we should build it there because nobody's going to get off if you put more lanes onto that. So that's the reality. At a certain point, you can't add more lanes to get anything off of Eastlake because of the choke point up north. And that was, King County says that they had even identified that before we incorporated, that their plans to this date still show doubling Sahalli coming down to try to get it, and WSDOT was working on that. So that's an option. To the point that was mentioned earlier about the TIP, and again, this is a little bit of a shift. When we had our last city manager, Ben Yazici, used to use the TIP, the biggest benefit of it, because we didn't tie it to a transportation master plan where you would do your vision and your prioritizations, and we didn't have that, and we still don't, was there's a state requirement to have it on your TIP to be eligible for state grants and funds. And that was the biggest use of putting it on the TIP, so we can then look at getting those state grant funds and then be able to see how we can move those. And that was something that the then earlier Senator Dina Rossi was good at, being able to get us money because it was on the TIP to help us move funds for a number of our projects. So to the point of prioritization that Chrissy had mentioned, once we have that transportation master plan, you're able to do it, and then you can follow more hierarchical, but it's not a direct point where you can allow failures or you're required to allow failures, because we just don't have that kind of money to put into it until another flyover is built. And Sahalli may turn out to be that way, that it could be just prohibitively expensive, and we'll have to analyze that similar situation after we put the safety mitigations, left-hand turns in. So, thank you.
Well, I was going to make a comment, but Deputy Mayor Hornish.
Yeah, I'm really struggling with how under the GMA you can allow failures. I was reading 2 cases today that says if you try to exempt a project from the transportation concurrency requirement, you can't do that. So maybe Jesse, you can explain. I don't think we had the Eastlake Sammamish Parkway failing under the current system. It always passed. It was never exempt, correct?
And actually, I think I told you it was exempt earlier today. That wasn't correct. Table T8 allowed capacity that prevented,
So I'm struggling with the comment that we can allow failures. If we allow failures, then development stops, period.
Yeah, and I want to make a quick comment too about specific to Eastlake Sammamish Parkway, and I'm glad our deputy city manager referenced T8, because that was the only reason that Eastlake Sammamish Parkway was allowed to pass, because of T8. We've now gotten rid of T8, and I just want to highlight the point that because we're now moving to a level of service at intersections, we have certainly done a disservice, or will do a disservice, to that section of roadway, and it would behoove us then to look at time of travel ultimately, because there are no intersections on the north end of Eastlake Sammamish Parkway. From the last one is at Inglewood Hill Road. The next intersection is outside of our jurisdiction, which means we have no yardstick to measure on Eastlake Sammamish Parkway with doing level of service. Councilmember Valderrama, you still have your light on, you?
Yeah, that's King Jesse. As I recall, on Eastlake Sammamish Parkway with the council, with Tom Modell on it, we were seeing it going to fail, and then they went back and figured out a way to exempt it because there was an uproar of the citizens. In fact, it was the Sammamish Review, I believe, had run a poll saying that that was the most wasteful project, and we wanted it off the TIP. And then they came back and said, hey, we can take into account the trail is, and whether you call it under T8 or not, that was the rationale that had come up. I don't recall T8 being mentioned at that time, but it was an innovative manner to be able to basically address that we're not going to be able to come up with money on this. We've got a trail, let's take it into account. But I don't recall anybody ever mentioning T8 at that time. I don't know if, Tom, you remember. See, there was never a mention of T8, or it was just, we got to figure out a way to accept this, so.
But TA granted capacity to Eastlake Sammamish Parkway. With every foot wide the trail was, we allowed an additional 580 vehicles.
I understand, but that was an after fix that we were looking for. There was never a mention of TA. That was like, we got to exempt it, and they ran back to the back room and came out with smoke coming up and said, okay, here we go now.
Okay. I have Councilmember Ritchie.
Okay. Trying to understand what's going on a little bit better. I'm concerned with what Deputy Mayor Hornish had to say. And I'd like you to correct me if I can, please, if you would. If we are within our current concurrency model or level intersection level of service or time of travel, if there is a failure at any concurrency measured intersection under the GMA, we cannot have any new development until that is remedied or until we have a different level of service calculation. I'm trying to understand what you meant by that.
Or we have a financial commitment or strategy to fix it within 6 years.
Within 6 years. And that is current code as it stands right now.
Current state law,
Current
GMA.
state law.
The GMA. I can read you the GMA,
I'm
and I'll
hearing
be
you.
happy to do it. It's section 6B.
How does,
I'll give you this site even more, but it's RCW 36.70A.070, paragraph 6B. And I'll paraphrase a little bit, but it says, after adoption of the comp plan, who people have to plan under the GMA, local jurisdictions must adopt and enforce ordinances which prohibit development approval if the development causes the level of service on a locally owned transportation facility to decline below the standards adopted in the comp plan, unless you have a plan to do it concurrently within 6 years of the development.
and we do not have that for 9 intersections in the city?
No, they're not adopted, so no.
So technically, they're not failing because they weren't adopted in the comp plan.
Yes. That's where the code change that I'm suggesting is that we shouldn't be using the comp plan as the fallback for what we should be measuring.
If it's failing, it's failing.
If we should be using the most relevant data to say whether or not an intersection is failing or
Well, I don't
not.
disagree with that. I'm curious as to how this plays into what we're trying to do right now. I mean, are we going to go, should we address the comp plan issues before we address
We're
concurrency?
addressing them now. This is what we're doing. There'll be comp plan changes.
Before we address a concurrency
Well,
plan?
when we do this, because we're going to adopt a level of service, and with that adoption of a level of service, we will adopt failures, because there are existing failures in the city.
So by
now.
adopting failures, what is
That will inform our TIP that we are going to do this summer anyway, because we do it on an annual basis.
Right.
And it looks out, the TIP looks at 6 years.
Okay,
So
so I'm-
it will inform us of what we need to put on our TIP to fund, but we need to find the funding.
Right.
And I'll remind you that last year, they identified Issaquah Pine Lake Road was a $49 million project.
I get
So
it.
I'm just giving you magnitude
let me
for
just-
some of the failures.
I appreciate that, and my concern here is looking forward, not looking back. We're looking forward now.
Yep.
If we are talking about how to fund these failures going forward,
We're not there yet.
well, no, I am. That's what I'm trying to figure out. If we're seriously considering putting these things into the comp plan and essentially highlighting a series of failures, that is what tools do we have at that point? Those are new failures. So current, please correct me if I'm wrong here, current impact fees cannot pay for those new failures. Is that accurate?
Not necessarily. Yeah, that's like Kendra talking.
Yeah, I think there's
Please,
some
I need to,
caveats there.
that's what I'm trying to figure out, what
Have a
tools we
light.
have. Thank you.
So good discussion here, and there are so many points I want to cover on. I'll cover that one first, though. Related to impact fees, there's calculations that we go through when we craft a transportation impact fee, and we do, so you kind of go through the math on eligible projects. So let's say all of these intersections are eligible projects because they're providing, good capacity, they're within local streets and roads, right-of-way. There's all kinds of GMA parameters that define what kinds of projects can be funded by impact fees. There's a very prescribed process, and you do actually have to calculate the portion of that fix that's related to an existing deficiency. So what I would say is those projects, no, we can all say with a straight face, they are not 100% impact fee eligible, but a portion of those projects could be funded with impact fees. And I haven't done a calculation for these intersections, but I'll tell you, your impact fees can help you along the way with them. So that's the first piece I wanted to address. I think the other point that you brought up was these 9 intersections that, when we look at the more recent data, they're failing. What I'd say is that those are a mixed bag. I'd say many of those projects, actually, there probably are some fixes on the city's 6-year TIP that would help remedy them. But there's probably some that haven't been foreseen in the past, and those are ones that once we get policy direction from you and we define what that list of concurrency failing intersections are, it's going to be go time for staff and the consultant team to figure out what are the appropriate fixes. The last piece that I really wanted to address, the mayor, I think she's brought up a great example. I love thinking about East Lake Sammamish Parkway. I think, you bring up the failings of Table T8. Of course, I came here and presented on, there were some great things about Table T8. Loved that it kind of helped you fund complete streets projects with impact fees. That was great. But on the other hand, it did some ludicrous stuff that I think we all just said, this doesn't pass the sniff test. So from the perspective of, as we're thinking forward, again, I'm going to just direct your attention to this slide here. Concurrency is a tool. It's one of our tools. It's not a perfect tool. Like it is not a silver bullet, and I hope that I've never indicated that it is. It needs to be worked at in concert with all these other things. So when we talk about what's going to help fix East Lake Sammamish Parkway, coordination with the state is going to be really critical. We need to think about in the TMP, what does that corridor need to look like? What are there parallel facilities that can help? I remember one time when I was talking to a previous council member in an interview, one of that individual's ideas was, let's get a new way off of the plateau. Just really out of the box thinking, that's the opportunity we have here. So I guess, just really, when we think about concurrency, it's a tool that we do here in Washington State, and they do it in Florida, and the other 48 states in the union do okay without concurrency. So we have to obey it. It's a state law and regulation that we have to work within, but I'd say let's not think too hard about it. There's a lot of other really great tools here. So we want to craft the right tool for Sammamish. The previous council started this process, identified that the program that's on the books today isn't really the program we want to have. So we've got this opportunity to rewrite it, and that's what we want to work closely with you to do. And we want to, kind of hear what these concerns are. But we've got this great opportunity to take your current, and this is 14 and 14A, and rip them up, burn them, and start again, if that's the pleasure of this council.
Ms. Deputy City Manager.
Thank you. Tagging on to Kendra, I just want to offer some caution here. As you think about your concurrency policy, there are a lot of transportation problems it will not fix. It will not identify. We spent this morning talking about an intersection that just unbelievably is not failing concurrency. In the past, East Lake Sammamish Parkway, we highlighted. Table T8 was amended at some point to add capacity for the trail. That brought some concern over the years. So rather than doing spot changes to address spot problems, to Kendra's point, let's use the other tools in our toolbox to fix those other areas. Concurrency is got kind of a micro focus at times. It won't fix your other transportation problems or identify problems.
Deputy Mayor Hornish.
Yeah, I was talking with another fellow engineer a few weeks ago that I think linearly, and to kind of address Councilmember Ritchie's point, I think in my mind the steps are we've got to decide on what methodology we want to use to test concurrency. Then we need to decide what level of service, A, B, C, D, E, F. Then we've got to look at what's failing and what needs fixed as number 3. And number 4, we got to figure out how to fund it on the tip for those failings. If we start at number 4 and focus on how we're going to fund it and decide when that's going to drive what methodology and what our LOS is, I think that's the wrong way of doing it. I think it needs to be 1, 2, 3, 4. And if 4 is too expensive, we go back up and maybe check 1 and 2 again. But right now, we shouldn't be worried about what methodology and what level of service we need to establish for concurrency because we're afraid it's going to cost too much until we know it is going to cost too much, and then we can go back and reevaluate it. But we have to go linearly, in my mind, methodology, level of service, What's failing? What's it going to cost?
I would agree. I mean, tonight, we're at least charged with,
The first one. the
yes,
methodology.
number one. So I just wanted to re-highlight that before I go back to the buttons again. Okay, Councilmember Stewart.
So, as your fellow engineer in that conversation, so I would agree that where we are right now, that step one is determining a level or a concurrency methodology, but I would argue that the appropriate step one is to have a plan for a transportation system, and then determine the methodology for validating that that system continues to function properly. I know that we opted.
We did, and we can't bring it back up.
I'm just saying,
Okay,
if we're going to talk about the appropriate steps, I just want to say that I don't believe that concurrency methodology is really a starting place. It is, as we discussed, a test of our transportation system, of which we don't have a plan for one yet. So I would say, yes, tonight we will focus on that methodology. But hopefully we will very soon get back to actually a plan for a transportation system.
Councilmember Ritchie.
I'm concerned that the linear process that Deputy Mayor Hornish just laid out is going to get us into a situation where we are looking at a huge tax burden placed on our citizens. And we will have put together a plan, spent staff time, modified the comp plan, done everything we need to do, thinking that we're going down this path because it makes sense, and it may be right. And I agree. I think that we need to look at the cost to the taxpayer throughout the entire process. If we find ourselves dropping a huge bill in front of the taxpayers, I think it's fair to look at what happened with the Lake Washington bond recently. And I would want to at least make sure that we are taking the cost of the roads, the improvements, the corrections to the failures into consideration at every step. I don't think it makes sense to ignore the cost at any level. I think it's critical. It is the determining factor, but it is a critical factor in everything we do up here. I mean, I think it would be irresponsibly from a fiduciary level to ignore the cost to our taxpayers and then wait till 4 and then add up the bottom line and go, oh, there's $200 million. Good luck. See ya. You know, that's not what I want to be doing at all here. And I do agree that we can find a way to kind of mix it together. We are working through our level of service, our concurrency plan right now, and we're going to move forward TMP. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm behind it. It's water under the bridge. But don't we at least need to be aware of costs as we're going along? And I would hope that we can ask staff as we're going along, what is this going to cost the taxpayers, so that it is another variable that we can plug in to help us make some decisions?
Councilmember Valderrama.
Yeah, just following on, I think our fiduciary responsibility requires us to look at the cost. I mean, all of us have kids. When they start looking at colleges, believe it or not, one of the factors that's weighed there up front is how much is this going to cost me? That may outweigh anything else as the problem. That's the truth that's going on. The reality of what happened with Lake Washington School District, the reality of the failure of the bond in Issaquah, we could be going down a rabbit hole here and come out and have wasted a lot of time. I'm concerned that we're weaponizing concurrency. I think that's a term that several of you have used in the past that I'll pick up on, particularly given the discussion today that we are told that the biggest concern, repeatedly told, that the biggest concern of our citizens are those intersections outside of our city. Then I'm wondering, why are we spending all the time on the concurrency? Maybe we should be focusing more on that SEPA, those projects that are SEPA that take into account those intersections. But I think it would be folly, especially in this climate and especially with all that's going on, that even our state legislators are trying to pull back and get some relief from McCleary, to not take into account what is the burden we're going to be looking at handing over. I think it would be a failure of our fiduciary responsibilities not to have that forefront. Thank you.
Councilmember Moran.
Well, I agree with what Councilmember Valderrama said. However, I also feel like the city has done a poor job in spending money on our roads for a lot of years. And so, putting it off and putting it off and putting it off is not going to help that. So we need to look at it. We need to look at what the price tag is, and we need to address it. So it is what it is. I mean, so I feel like we need to find out what it is, figure out what we're going to do about it, and if it's a number that's not reasonable, we're going to have to look at that and see how to fix it. But we owe it to the citizens and said we would find out what the problem is and fix it. And it's interesting, I got to have a conversation over the weekend with the mayor of Issaquah, who said that Issaquah residents are watching what we're doing with our concurrency, because they're finding that they like our conversations, they agree with us what we're doing on concurrency, and she said, and they're wanting to follow. So, people are watching what we're doing on this. They're agreeing that, the way that we're going, and they're seeing what we're doing. I think that we owe what we promised, which is we were looking into this, we were going to find out where the problems were, and we were going to try to address it. And I think we need to stay on track.
I'm going to make a quick comment before we go back through some of the same buttons that are lighting up here, which is I agree that the financial component is certainly relevant to the conversation, but as we're sitting up here, every ding that you guys hear in the audience is someone else emailing us about the traffic problems that we have in the city, and we have got to listen to that voice too. So there is a balancing act between the financial component and a lack of changes that the city has undertaken in the past. Frankly, the city, it's been a long time since the city has done a major road project that has added capacity in the city. And by the mere fact that we were using 2012 data to look at whether or not we were doing okay, here it is 2018, 6 years later, and we're using 6-year-old data. Does anyone notice what's happened in the last 6 years? We have had a ton of homes being constructed, and our residents are speaking out that they're frustrated about sitting in traffic. So yes, I agree with you. The financial component is certainly relevant here, but not doing anything is not an option. So we've got to make some fixes, and we need to know, first we've got to give staff, here's the LOS that we're going to use. And then I need to ask for the audience to please withhold comments. Thank you. So I think we need to give staff some direction on what the council wants to do. And we talked about these rabbit holes that we may very well go down and have to come back out of, unfortunately. But there's no way to get the financial answer unless we tell staff, this is the direction we want to go. And then they may have to give us an answer. So it may take some time to go through the exercise to find out what the dollar signs are on the other side of it. But I'm happy to hear that Kendra said it's a little bit of a mixed bag. There are impact fees that are going to be eligible to fix some of these projects, I would hope. So,
May I respond to that?
I've got to go in order of the lights here. Deputy Mayor Hornish.
I just want to say how much I agree with Romero and Jason. I think the funding of it is fundamental, but my point is you can't figure it out. Right until tonight, we had 3 different options. Did we want staff to go in to figure out what was failing under those 3 different options to come up with what would be the required funding for those 3 different options? No. We've got to decide on the methodology first, the level of service, then they can tell us how much it's going to cost, and we can determine if we can afford that or not. And if not, we iterate. We go back and decide, okay, different methodology, different level of service, how much is it going to cost, can we afford that? But you can't figure out how much it's going to cost with 5 different methods. These guys will never get anything done.
Ms. Deputy City Manager.
Thank you. Good segue. We spent a lot of time last year discussing that very subject. What is our new methodology? And I don't know that this council has stated it, but the staff are still working on the theory that this is an interim concurrency policy to bridge a gap between now and completion of the transportation master plan and whatever the master plan indicates is a perhaps future policy or change for concurrency. One of the reasons the staff are recommending intersection level of service is because it's intersections only. Arguably, the improvements to those intersections cost less than the entire corridor segment improvement methodology we had previously. That doesn't mean those corridors and segments don't need to be improved at some point, but if you think about this as an interim measure, it buys us some time. We get a new policy in place. We haven't done the cost estimating yet. We need direction on methodology. scalability, it is a lower cost approach to concurrency. We will let the TMP then dictate the larger projects, buy you some more time to talk comprehensively about your funding strategies and how we do this whole array of projects, including your concurrency projects over time. I don't want to minimize the costs. I think, unfortunately, some of these intersections are going to be costly to repair. Some of them may be addressed with something like signal timing. I mean, it could be that simple. So that's kind of the range of the next 2 to 5 years, but I wanted to mention that.
Councilmember Ritchie.
I appreciate that we're trying to go through this in a certain process, a step-by-step process, and I appreciate that we need to move forward to this interim plan, intersection level of service, to try to bridge a gap, if you will. My only concern is, more to Deputy Mayor Hornish's point, what does that lock us into, if anything? And I don't know that. I'm asking. I'm hoping that before we vote on something, before we take a step forward, whether it's tomorrow or in 2 weeks, whenever it is, that we can say, okay, we have an intersection level of service, we've asked staff to move forward with that, and then we predict, and I don't know if this can be done without a TMP in play. I don't know, but I'm hopeful that we can have a ballpark number that says it's going to cost X, and we have 6 years to get there, or 3 years on this and 6 years on that. I don't know, because it's iterative and we have other things coming in. Can we get a number before we vote?
Yes. Can I address that? I want to make sure. If we get direction on methodology tonight and it's confirmed tomorrow, we will begin working on the final list of failures, if you will. Early next month, we will confirm that list with you, and by June, at the latest, we will have recommendations for repairs and cost estimates. It will take us a little time. This is engineering. So yes, before you adopt your final concurrency policy and your code revisions, you will have that information.
Utilizing 2000
And the tip.
Utilizing what year data?
Utilizing 2016 is the current plan right now.
With intersection level of service.
Correct.
Most updated data, kind of temporary or intermediate process. Okay, thank you.
I have a question on that real quick, though. Don't we have 2017 data already?
We do, and I can
You're not using that?
address that a little bit.
Okay.
Because that was a question that I had seen come through, and I kind of checked with the old team on that. Transportation projects take a while. So often, and I run into this all the time, we do environmental documents, SEPA documents. I mean, you have to at one point just say, okay, this is our existing condition. These are the counts, this is the year horizon that we're going to say that this represents current conditions. Yes, there are 2017 counts that were collected last April. The work that was done to kind of get to the results that we're talking about today was started prior to April of 2017. And so that's the reason why it was using 2016 data. So that's kind of where we are. I mean, I don't want to open a can of worms. Probably sometime in 2018, we'll have 2018 counts. I would say that, we're going to be, I like the idea. And again, as we have the opportunity to write code here over the next couple of months, I really love the idea of, hey, let's make sure that we're a little more modernized in our approach. Now, where that is, there's of course a Goldilocks approach. I think what you're raising is that we're using too old of stuff right now. 2012, frankly, isn't acceptable. That gives a very different condition than really what's on the ground today. At the same time, updating every year, the increment of benefit that would give you is probably very costly. And so you just have to balance in terms of how much staff and professional resource time do you want in order to mimic, the most up-to-date data.
Can you clarify, though, even though the 2016 data is the base, we have added in the development that occurred since that time and the capital improvement projects?
Correct. So we're going to be
other things?
We'll be coming back. So this is the piece. So we've been talking a lot about what's on the ground today. Now, when you make for our concurrency determination, that's actually going to be at a more of a 2024 horizon. Again, going with state law that you look out 6 years. So what it's going to do is layer on top of those 2016 counts all of the development that you've approved that's anticipated to be opening prior to 2024. It's also going to take into account in the traffic modeling the projects that you're funding to have in place by 2024.
Councilmember Valderrama.
Yeah, I can appreciate following this approach and then finding out what the deficiencies we've identified are. The only problem is it's kind of reminiscent of that old adage is you have to pass it before you know what's in it, and that scares me. So I'm going to go back to the analogy of college. So when you have your kid and he says, okay, what college? You usually say, well, here's your 529, it's got 150, 200K into it, you're going to be in there. Maybe what we need to do then is to say, prior to picking any of these and to give guide rails to staff as well, as say, what are we willing to stomach of passing to our citizens for newfound deficiencies, and agreed to a number that we're willing to start saying, is it 50 million, 100 million? But come up with a number so when we go into it, similar to when you look at your child and say, this is how much we're willing to go to, that we have some new parameters. And then whatever else is needed, we'll go get federal aid or student aid or whatever, likewise getting the grants. But maybe what we should do is sit back and say, how much is this council ready to prepare to give to its citizens in a debt bond request? And then go into this, and then they can quickly look at it and say, you know, this is going to far exceed it. I don't want it to be like the community center. The first time they say, oh yeah, go on out there and tell us what you want. And they came back with, what was it, $78 million that they came back with? And everybody said, whoa, damn, we never meant that. We better go back again, do whole new surveys, whole new plans to go across it. And we wasted a lot of time, and people were upset with the whole new reset exercise. So if this is the way we're going, maybe we should just come out and come to some agreement. What's the tolerance of the council to put out a debt bond, and then look at each of these models, select it, and do a preliminary check. Rough order of magnitude is more than 50 million to throw a number out. Let's go back and do another one. That's my suggestion, because otherwise we're going down, as many of us now have said, the rabbit holes.
Councilmember Ross.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the freshness of the data, 2012, 2016, but doesn't shifting from a capacity model type with the T8 to a more a congestion model by that approach and that change alone create a lot of deficiencies or failures?
Well, recall that your previous, the code that's currently on the books today includes both T8, which is the, as you say, kind of that capacity-based segment net level. It also includes an intersection level of service. So we, are measuring intersection level of service today. It's not at the number of intersections. It's a smaller number of them, and it's only PM peak hour. So again, what we're talking about here, and maybe I should advance to the next slide when we get here. I won't push the discussion any farther, but that is what we're going to talk about, is that, that will look at AM peak hour as well as PM peak hour. And so to the extent that you have some issues that are occurring in the morning when people are going to school that you weren't previously measuring, yes, potentially those are some new deficiencies. If I may, I'd love to actually respond a little bit to Councilmember Valderrama's comments. What I would say is that we are not at a point of no return. So to use the college analogy, if your child ends up going to Harvard and oopsie, after a year it's too expensive, yes, they can transfer to a community college or some other cheaper school, but you still have to pay that Harvard bill for the past year. The nice thing here with level of service standards is that if we get to the end of the TMP process and we realize that this level of service standard that maybe we adopted, maybe it was a little aggressive. We've got a few locations where, it's untenable. You can always revisit that and adopt exemptions in certain locations. And this happens all over the place. There are many cities that will exempt level of service standards within their downtown, or they'll set it just to level of service F. And what they say is, you know what, in this area, while yes, we do care about driver experience and travel time, we care about maintaining the urban form more. We care about walkability more. So what I'd say, and affordability. So what I'd say is that please don't be fearful that what you do today is casting the city in stone for the next decades or more. You can always update this. You have the discretion to make a change whenever you need to.
You mean allowing them to fail and not taking, is what you're saying, is allowing failure to take place by exempting them, correct? By
allowing a higher level of congestion. I mean, I think let's talk also about the term failure. Yeah. That may not be the best term. I work in lots of downtowns where they've accepted let's say, 85 or 90 seconds of delay. That's what we refer to it. And we recognize that, hey, is it worthwhile within your downtown to maintain this character that they want, that we accept as drivers we're going to wait a little bit longer because that allows the downtown to remain intimate. Again, I'm not saying there's necessarily a parallel here in Sammamish, but what I'm saying is let's not think about it in terms of necessarily pass or fail, but in terms of trade-offs. And that there's, delay is one very important metric, but there's a lot of other metrics that we're going to be considering as a part of the TMP.
Well, and I think that's what Councilmember Ritchie and I are saying is, what's the cost and what are we willing to stomach? And if not, then let's just do kind of what we did with the trail on Sammamish and say, well, we're going to exempt it under a new thing and justify that exemption.
Deputy Mayor Hornish.
So I want to pick up on that a little bit to make sure I understand. So just because we say we want to establish an LOS of D and E for more than 3 approach lanes, we could. I think what I'm hearing you say, but I want to clarify. If we find an intersection is not meeting that level of service, I didn't use fail, not meeting that level of service. Instead of saying that that's the blanket level of service throughout the city, we could say, for that intersection, we're going to allow it to go to E, even though it doesn't meet that caveat of 3 approach lanes. Is that what you're saying? Or even F, to your point?
Yes.
So we can do it on an intersection by intersection basis if it's too expensive for that intersection. Okay, I like that.
Yes, so your level of service, Paul, it may not be as pretty and as neat as to say it's D everywhere, but there's lots of cities, they call out, in this area of the city, I'm working in Gig Harbor right now, and in the harbor area, they allow for a higher level of congestion than the rest of the city because of its unique characteristics. So yes, you have the power to do that.
It's not an exemption, it's a lowering of the level of service.
It's a different policy for that specific location.
Okay.
Councilmember Stewart.
Does that mean we could also, for example, have a different level of service, say, for areas right in front of a school or an intersection by a school, even set it different just for, say, a certain period of time during the day, so that we aren't trying to build an entire transportation system costing hundreds of millions of dollars to solve a 15 or a 30-minute problem outside of one school? Is that something we can also write into our policy?
You can set it by time. I mean, and we'll go through the results in a few minutes here. I mean, we are seeing, when we look at the school, AM peak hour, we're seeing a few more impacts than if we looked at kind of a system-wide AM peak hour. But yes, to the extent that you want to allow for that level of congestion, again, you can do that.
Cool.
Actually, I have no more questions up here right now, so let's get to the next slide.
All right. So intersection level of service, where we were again, here we are. And I'm actually getting a little lost on my notes. Oh, yes. So as a recap, the 2 options that we've brought tonight to talk about are, kind of essentially 2 intersection level of service flavors of it. One is intersection-wide delay for the AM and PM peaks, which would measure the average experience for all, kind of approaches at that intersection altogether. One number.
Just to clarify, a weighted average, right?
A weighted average, volume weighted average, thank you. And then the worst approach actually looks at, of these, so Issaquah Pine Lake Road and 228th here, if we were doing that, we'd look at, what is the worst approach of this? And we'd be saying, okay, if that worst approach is not meeting our standard, then we're going to declare that intersection as being deficient. So clearly, the worst approach is a more stringent standard than the intersection-wide weighted average. We have kind of pulled back the modified worst approach that we brought a few meetings ago, only because it didn't seem like it was really adding all that much benefit, and it was making your code more complex without, huge. So we took that one out, and we feel like these 2 are probably a good clear-cut set of options to start with. Using the 2016 AM and PM peak hour data, We looked at the 43 in-city concurrency intersections, and we measured them based on those two policies that we talked about. Now, as we've talked about at length tonight, concurrency determinations actually will be done at the 2024 horizon. That's something we're still kind of working on, getting that, pipeline model all finished up, and we'll be bringing that to you kind of later in the spring. April is kind of our anticipation at this point. So here's the results updated from what was in your packet. So the results are that we've got essentially, when we use the average intersection approach, we have 9 deficiencies that we would be identifying in a 2016 condition. The worst approach, we have 11. And I guess, what I would put here is, as we're mentioning this, just some things to observe. Clearly, by bringing AM into the equation, we're identifying some intersections that should be addressed that weren't being looked at when we were just considering PM peak hour. We've actually elected to go with 7 to 8 a.m., which is kind of that school peak hour. It's not technically the AM system peak hour. I'll just, for full disclosure, if you were to look at all of the time in the morning and go out and count all the traffic volumes in the city, it's actually a little higher after the 8 o'clock hour. But when we think about where there are some real concentrated nodes of activity, for example, around schools, we find that there's actually more impacts during that 7 to 8 o'clock hour. And so given the interest and the ongoing discussions we've had, we've looked there.
Kendra, I've got a question. Hold on
Yes,
just a second.
thank you.
Councilmember Stewart.
I'm sorry. So there was discussion earlier about an addition of intersections. So the current code has, 30? So there are 23 within the city and 7 outside the city. Now we're talking about having 43 intersections. Are those
Inside.
all? I'm sorry?
Inside.
So it's 43 inside. Where did those other 23 come from? Is it all intersections in the city now? How did we select those? I'm sorry.
Some of it's going to be Klahani. We didn't have Klahani in there before, so that would be part of the addition.
Do you guys have something to add to that in terms of the historical that led to how you got to the 43 being selected?
From what I understand, they were added because we were observing some issues with those intersections, both just more congestion. We wanted to make sure that we were evaluating them for concurrency issues.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Ritchie.
I know that bell times are an issue. My sons go to school, one at 8 o'clock and one at 9 o'clock. And have you taken that into consideration? And those change year to year, which is a lot of fun for parents trying to get to school or get to work, get to school, get our kids to school and then get to work.
Oh, yeah.
Is that something you've taken into consideration? And is there flexibility to know that the peak times around the schools, as Councilmember Stewart's been saying, that is one of the, if not the critical points that we see? This is a bedroom community with a lot of kids going to school in the mornings and the evenings. Is that something that's been taken into consideration? And can we add that data in year to year as those bell times change?
Well, what I would say is, again, remember the arsenal of, and I don't want to be a broken record here, there's a lot of tools. So yes, first of all, I live right by Bellevue High School, so I fully appreciate what bell times are. What I would say is that when we picked these times, the 7 to 8 o'clock hour was picked because it had a lot of impacts. So we looked at actually traffic counts that were collected between 7 and 9 a.m. And that coincided with a lot of the school bell times, not all of them. We've got 2 districts here. There's a lot of, kind of things going on.
Moving parts.
But, as we're thinking about operations around schools, concurrency, again, is just one tool. So when you're thinking about planning for it, and that's why INREX data and kind of all those pieces have been brought in, your staff is working really proactively to also identify improvements that their hands aren't being forced by concurrency. Again, they're trying to plan a system that's safe and functional, and some of these improvements, most of the improvements I would posit that we're going to come up with as a part of the TMP really won't have a lot to do with concurrency and level of service. They're going to have to do with safe walking environment to school or addressing areas where we get numerous citizen complaints or safety issues.
Okay, thank you.
So Kendra, I want to piggyback on that a little bit as far as looking at the system peak hour. And I brought this up during our agenda meeting earlier, which was there are 3 intersections, 3 in the PM, incidentally, that were identified as a different level of service in June of 2017. And I was perplexed by that. So I asked the question during the agenda meeting today. And I think my understanding was that they didn't use 445 to 545. They were using a different peak in order to identify those failures. Correct me if I'm wrong. My question back was, okay, if we have some intersections, and it's Southeast 32nd Way and 244th Avenue East, it's identified as an E, whereas previously over the summer, it was an F. Just above it, Klahani Drive and Issaquah Falls City Road was actually better. It was a D. And then 256th Avenue, East Beaver Lake Drive, and Issaquah Beaver Lake Drive, the very last one, that was an E. So that would have been technically a failure where it's passing here. And my question is, instead of applying a one time to each intersection citywide, should we be looking at the intersections for their peak hour to properly identify them?
So we may not have fully represented the correct answer this morning. Kendra has tagged in since and maybe can explain the full reasoning behind the difference.
Okay.
Well, quickly, just on, the differences that are occurring. I mean, I think you've brought up a lot of them. So a lot of refinement has occurred since 2017. As we've looked through kind of those results that were presented last summer, and again, that was a different consulting team, and, kind of all of that. First of all, we've, updated some of the methodologies. There's a couple of intersections, not the ones that you mentioned, where an improper methodology was being used. So, the computer modeling, there was an update to it, but the new version has an error in it. And so for those isolated issues, to make sure that we're really reflecting what's going on in the field, we actually have to revert to the old program. And let me just say, this isn't the only community. That is standard practice in the transportation consulting community, and that's going to give you more accurate results. But that's just in a few locations. With regards to the intersections that you're referring to, there's lots of things that have changed. One, peak hour factors have been updated. In some cases, traffic volumes or some of the assumptions have changed for those intersections. For example, I think there was a few where we weren't reflecting the flashing yellow arrows that occurred. So that's been updated since the fall time. You mentioned one intersection where we went from I think it was an E to a D. And in that case, it was really just less than a second of delay, and it was just where you were right at a threshold issue. And with those updates to the model that I just mentioned, that's what led to kind of an improvement. I stand by the numbers that you're looking at here as the appropriate numbers, because a lot of time and care has been paid to more accurately represent traffic conditions today.
Okay, very good. I don't see any more questions, so.
Okay, well, I guess, do I get to then come to the question, the conclusions and recommendations here? So I guess the first thing is, we need confirmation on the updated project schedule, that council is comfortable with that. And then the second is really, we need direction to meet that project schedule. We do need direction tonight on kind of the appropriate intersection level of service policy to move forward. Again, not cast in stone. We're not making a city decision that will be here forever. But for us to begin evaluating, well, what are the delays and what are concurrency intersections that aren't meeting the standard? We need to know kind of what is that at least starting point of a standard for us to use. Staff has recommended intersection-wide average delay of level of service D. So again, this is the average delay, weighted average delay, not the by approach. And staff has also recommended that we maintain the allowance for level of service E, where level of service D cannot be achieved with kind of the 3 lanes. And that's in your current comp plan. And the policy background there is that we don't want to pave over the city. At some point, having an approach of more than 3 lanes is viewed as not being in the character of Sammamish. And so we're trying to maintain that character where possible.
Deputy Mayor Hornish.
I'm going to answer the questions. Number one, can we do it quicker? I know. So I am, my head nod is definitely on this schedule, but I hope we can stick to it, is kind of the caveat. I am in favor of the intersection-wide average delay and keeping it at D with some exceptions for E if it's 4 approach lanes or more to allow an E LOS, which is no different than we currently have. And I think what we're looking to do is add the AM analysis. And we've now highlighted and confirmed and revised our method, our intersection LOS, to be what we think is closer. It's not going to be perfect, I understand that. And it doesn't measure some things that we would like to measure. But I'm on board with the intersection-wide delay of D with caveat to E in some cases. That's where I'm at.
I don't have any more lights, so I will concur. I support staff's recommendation, and this is different from what our slide deck says here, so I appreciate that where D cannot be achieved per the comp plan. So, Councilmember Stewart.
When something fails during a peak hour, and we talked about this before, and I apologize for not remembering, does that mean that it's a 15-minute failure, 30 minutes? Like, I know it doesn't have to fail for the whole hour. It only has to fail for a fraction of that hour. What is that fraction?
Well, there's a peak hour factor that gets applied, and the peak hour factor is based on 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay.
So it does take into account that peaking, but there's kind of some things interplayed there.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Valderrama.
Well, first I want to go back 1 second to the chart before that. Level of services, concurrency. This one now has in it built in that travel latency delay or not?
Oh, sorry. And I want to make sure I'm fully understanding your question.
So this is being measured differently than we were measuring in the past. This is the new measure, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so that's the first one. I have a problem accepting D, especially when I look at all the red across it, because, I mean, this goes back to the earlier discussion, is it sounds to me that we're coming up with a massive bill that's going to be hitting our citizens, and most of these are inside our city, when our citizens...
All of these are.
Exactly, and our citizens haven't been complaining about inside. They complain about the schools every now and then at a time. The real complaint is Redmond and Issaquah. But I look at this and we're saying, if we accept this, we're telling our citizens, you're going to pay for a boatload of stuff that you haven't been complaining about. So, I mean, looking at this, I think we better start looking at accepting Fs across the number of Fs I'm seeing here.
Councilmember Ross. Oh, sorry, Steve, did you have a comment?
I'm just going to point out that Issaquah Falls City Road project, which has 2 projects listed as currently deficient, is in design.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Issaquah Falls City Road will take care of 2 failures on that list. Just
2 of all these reds will be taken care of. Thank you.
without doing anything. Good job.
Yeah. I'll sleep better tonight. My wallet won't.
Councilmember Ross.
I'd like to go back to what Deputy Mayor Hornish outlined is really a 4th step, and I see it as iterative and circular, starting with methodology levels, service, what is failing, and then how do we fund it? That's the key. How do you fund it? But what we learned today is we can look at some of those intersections individually and make some decisions. Do we lessen the level of service if it is not a financially good investment for that intersection to bring it up to a higher level of service? So I support that and use that iterative process to help us manage the budget aspect of it.
Councilmember Ritchie.
Okay, so if we go with this plan, the level of service intersection-wide average delay, if I'm looking at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 failing intersections with this new level of service policy, this new concurrency policy, am I to understand that we can actually take each one and say, we're okay with it being an F, and therefore we would not have to pay to have it resolved and have it included in our tip?
I would say if you want to adopt that into your policy, if you determine, for financial reasons, and let's talk about financial, very important, not lost on me, but we're going to embark upon a TMP process.
Right.
And maybe we find that some of these fixes are counter to other aims that we have as a part of the city, and we want to allow maybe a higher level of congestion here because it has some sort of benefit that we haven't yet figured out because we haven't done the TMP. I think, yes, what I would say is you have the ability to exempt intersections. They're not being exempted from your level of service standard. You would establish a different one that's more fitting.
Oh, we're on the same page, but we can't talk about that, right? That happened already, right? We're doing concurrency first. I agree with you. We're looking at things we could fix if we had all those other tools, but I'm saying based upon concurrency policy, based upon what we're trying to decide right now, what's in front of us, the decision you need today is a decision that has 9 different sub-decisions that we'll be able to make once we are better well-informed with the TMP.
Correct.
Actually, not totally. Tonight, you are not making a decision. Tomorrow night,
Sorry.
you're not
Thank
making. Even tomorrow night,
Nodding
you're
tonight,
technically
right.
not. You're providing us direction on a methodology, directing to staff to go study these intersection failures and come back to you
That's cool,
with
yeah.
with what the projects would look like. That is outside of the TMP. This is just our concurrency discussion and the TIP.
And can I just add one thing? It's this or what? There's no or, right?
We stay on the merry-go-round.
I mean, this is really the only choice we have in front of us. There's no X or Y or even Z. It's this plan because this is what staff and the consultant thinks is the best plan, but there is no other option in front of us. And the goal here, and I want to make sure I understand this, the reason we're pursuing this at this place, at this time, and at this speed with the calendar or the schedule we have in front of us has an end goal of releasing the moratorium?
Well, does somebody else want to?
I'll answer, yes, in July.
Okay.
That's the whole intent of why we chose concurrency over the TMP.
Okay.
I think the only thing I would place, because, is that the previous, this work clearly originated with the previous council. There were a lot of different level of service approaches that were investigated, and this was determined to be the most appropriate for the city at this time until maybe other things in the future could be looked at. So yes, I realize, we're kind of at the, tail end of a journey here that we've been on for a long time. And that's why I'm not coming here with, here's 8 different options for how you could do that. That was kind of a discussion that we had in the fall.
And it's an intermediate step. It's a reasonable intermediate step that we can take right now,
Correct.
looking 5 months, whatever July is now, down the road to be able to remove the moratorium if that's what the council decides we want to do. And then we would move into TMP mode, and then that would further inform us, and then we would move into another second step or third
Cleanup.
step, whatever it is, that would allow us to potentially have more information to put together a longer, more well-informed driver experience concurrency plan.
You got it.
Yep.
I'm getting it.
All right.
Thank you.
You're a fast learner.
I'm trying.
See, we're only in the third minute.
Councilmember Ross.
Yeah, I think I read or heard it, but I want to confirm it. This table does not reflect if we overlay the funded TIP. So isn't that a next step also, or is that already?
That is very correct. So that is work that's being completed right now, and that's what we're going to come back in April with.
Perfect, thanks.
Ms. Deputy City Manager.
Actually, segue to that, I don't want to get too far into the strategy camp, but you have a 6-year TIP coming up on the horizon. It may be on this list, there's a project that our project team identifies and says, hey, council, I think there may be an alternative solution we will arrive at in the TMP versus investing in a giant roundabout. We may recommend that for the end of your 6-year period so that we have time through the TMP process to further explore other alternatives. So once we get to the TIP discussion, you will also have an opportunity to prioritize these projects over a 6-year period.
Councilmember Valderrama.
Just to make sure, we have the choice of not taking D and taking a lower as the or option, lower level. And the 2 messages that I hear going out, having heard Ross and Hornish, is to say to our citizens, don't worry, because we can call it a failure and accept that, exempt it, is what we were saying. Exempt these-
Set a lower standard. I don't want
Yeah,
to say
so,
that we're
okay,
exempting
but
it.
we
we're setting
will,
a
in
lower standard.
effect, be accepting a lower standard, which would be for these areas, but it's basically the exempting and accepting the failures here is the reality of it. The other message, and that's one that we'd have to then try to look at, then I think a citizen would say, well, then why are we going through this whole exercise? Can't we do that now with the current model that we've been doing? And that's kind of what we did with East Lake Sammamish Parkway, in my mind, is what we did. And we then rejigged it and said, okay, let's use the trail. The other piece is a message to developers. Once this goes in, if I was a developer and you've now identified these, it's to say, okay, well, now you're going to be fixing the road, but I'm no longer on the hook for these. These are now yours, deficiencies, and I'm just picking up the incremental part on the impact because you've now said that this is the level that's there, where as of yesterday, that wasn't the case. If you were one of the developers, of Toll Brothers or Polygon or the other, wouldn't you just look at that and say that?
Well, I guess what I would say is that with the new data being brought in, even with your current
New data
concurrency-
that we now created as model.
just the new counts as your underlying baseline, even if you had your previous level of service, level of service policy that's currently on the books today, we have identified some deficiencies. So that was going to be an inevitable piece of this. Now, the question of how much of it is going to be paid for through impact fees versus other things, that's still a question that can be looked at.
Yeah, but don't the developers now look at this and say, this is the existing deficiencies that you've now stated, and they only pay the incremental?
Well, it's not an all or nothing, though. I mean, there is a pretty complicated, not complicated, it's not, but,
Understand, but
you know,
in
there's a
principle.
process that goes through. They'll recognize and say there's a deficiency, there's likely a deficiency piece of that. What I would say is that there's some grace, you know, in terms of timing, the sensible timing that communities go through this in terms of logical is, at this point, it's to update your plan and then to update your impact fee program. It looks like you've got something.
So again, it's math. When we're done, we'll figure out what fixes are going to be fixed, what is or isn't going to be relevant based on a level of service assignment to a specific intersection. For Councilmember Valderrama's math, previously we had 23 projects distributed over however many trips were in the system. We now have 43 projects, because those other ones don't go away. They're still there. So there will be, but yes, it is intersections, but the roadway network is still related to the intersection. So everything is still in play, like Kendra said. I know it's a leap of faith to understand that iterative process, but I wouldn't say that's.
There's going to be a lot of needs identified as a part of the TMP. So again, to the point, yes, the proportion of any given intersection might go down a bit as there's a deficiency. But I think to the extent that we're seeing more intersections and more project needs, and as a part of the TMP, we're growing that project list of good capacity growth accommodating projects. I'd say we don't have an answer at this point of where your impact fee is going to go.
Yeah, but these are more self-inflicting at this point. I mean, from the 23 to 43, and the latency of delays.
No, we had 8 failures coming up anyhow.
Well,
Now we've got 9.
Well, but not under the 23. I understand under the 23 there weren't any.
Well, I mean, here's what I would say is you added those additional intersections and got to 43 for a good reason. I think those were facilities that staff and council felt really they impact people's travel conditions in Sammamish, and so they decided these merit us paying attention to them. So, you know, whether or not we're looking at them from concurrency or not, you know, if they were something we weren't considering, that would just mean that, you know, we're essentially not paying as close of attention to that failure.
So would another option be, let's look at 23? I mean, some cities, I believe it's Bellevue, for example, go to zones. And they say, hey, let's look at the whole zones approach, which in some way the 23 in my mind would equivalent to that. And once you start breaking it further down into the 43, we've now started to open ourselves up to it. Maybe we should be looking at a different way of going back to the 23 into zones. Because I guess I still look at this as something that we're inflicting upon ourselves at this point in time, that we're going to be passing bills to our citizens that they're not noticing in the city today. They're all asking, as you recall when you came here, and that was your statement, the biggest problems are those outside the city, and now we're asking for money for inside the city. I'm trying to grapple with this and get it around my head around and my wallet around it.
Deputy Mayor Hornish.
Yeah, I want to go back to Councilmember Ritchie's point of other choices and a little bit of history. When you came here 6 months ago and started this, I think, we talked about time of travel. We talked about intersection level of service. We talked about a passenger or a commuter. What does Redmond use as far as the number of people being moved at any time on
Mobility units, yes.
Okay, and there were a couple other methodologies. I don't even remember all of them. But we chose at that time to focus on intersection for now because it was going to we thought it was the quickest path to something to be able to lift the moratorium. So from there, Kendra and her group gave us 3 choices: the average intersection LOS, the worst approach, and the hybrid. Tonight they're coming back and saying we're going to knock off the hybrid because it becomes complicated. So we've gone from a bunch to one that has a subset of 3, and now we're down to 2 of those. So you have a choice between an average or a worst approach. But I think there's another thing that you're asking for too, is the level of service, which is number 2 in my linear methodology, right?
Yeah.
And you raise it. You're recommending the D/E, and I guess that's another decision tree branch. Do we want to keep that DE or do we want to lower it? I don't think we would even consider raising it, even though our citizens might want us to. I think that would be kind of
Costly.
well, costly, but it wouldn't be fair, I don't think, to what we're trying to do. So, but that to try to outline what your decisions are, I think that hopefully that helps.
Councilmember Stewart.
So I think I'm okay with this weighted average intersection level of service, starting out with the DE, with the understanding that what I'm hearing is that we're all willing to look at an iterative approach to say, you know, as we find certain intersections, we may realize that, to your point, if we had a higher level of service in certain places, it just means I get to hurry up and wait. And so that is a lot of money spent for no good reason. So I look at it as a value proposition. So we may find as we go through this that there may be better value in saying there are other intersections we could lower to E for other reasons other than just the 3-lane approach, because there is no value to our taxpayers in spending the money to try to get it to a higher thing, because they're just going to get to the next intersection outside of our city and wait, or some other thing. Or to our deputy city manager's point, there may be alternatives that we have coming down the line where we could raise the level of service at a later date when we have things like transit or other options in play. So I'm comfortable going there with the understanding that we are being open and flexible to an iterative approach so that we do not impose some staggering tax bill onto our citizens.
Councilmember Ross.
Yeah, the only concern or thought I have, in addition to what we've discussed, is the driver experience. It feels mostly subjective in this case. There's really no measurement of latent demand or queuing up or any of that. So how do our citizens expect to have a better driving experience? How does this address it? And based on all the iterative processes and budget considerations, it's a lot of variables that we're trying to factor into this. But that, I think, is an important factor. How do we deal with that? Is that how we reset the level of service in our iterative process? How are we going to deal with that?
I don't know if you're looking for an answer from me. I think as a part of the TMP, those are the critical questions we're going to grapple with, is what is the system that we want to provide to our citizens? I think in terms of what this measuring stick is, this is using, state of the practice methodologies to essentially do a pass-fail for the intersections that you've determined to be important enough to be a part of your concurrency system.
I'm not seeing any more lights up Does staff feel like they have a general sense up here or not really?
Tomorrow.
You've got three of us, right?
Yeah, I think the three sitting here have given some direction. Does the balance of council want to give staff some kind of direction?
I am nodding my head, yes.
Okay. So is there anything else that staff needs from council tonight?
As long as
No,
it
we-
sounds
we-
like yes to both, right?
Right, so just to reiterate, you're okay with the schedule that we've proposed? And then D with allowance for E, assuming that you may decide to revisit that as you get more numbers in the future. And then we'll come back in April with more detail on those 8 or I guess 9 intersections that potentially could be failing.
So based on that, tomorrow, we hope sometime between noon and 1-ish, we will be updating your council packet with a resolution that now includes the direction that we received tonight. We're also adding one whereas statement into that resolution, so you'll see the change tomorrow. We will email you as soon as your packet is ready to be updated with the revised resolution.
Good. So is there anything for the good of the order here? No? All right, we're adjourned.